Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today at the Berggruen Institute to have a very interesting discussion, what I hope will be a very interesting discussion with Josh Berson and Simon Penny on the topic of keeping cool, lessons of low-tech thermoregulation for the climate change era. The jumping off point for this will be Josh Berson's just recently published book, The Human Scaffold. I'll show you a copy of it here. Published by the University of California Press just in the last few weeks. He did the work on this book in part when he was a fellow with us here at the Berggruen Institute a couple of years ago. Josh is an anthropologist whose work explores the ecology of sentient behavior over epochs ranging from the momentary to the geological, and across geographies ranging from, and time periods ranging from the present to the deep past. He's held appointments at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences, as well as the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, among other places, and is the author, in addition to The Human Scaffold, of Computable Bodies from 2015 and The Meat Question from 2019. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Josh to introduce his and my friend, Simon Penny. Josh.
Thank you, Nils. It's such a pleasure to be here with you again. So I first met Simon Penny at the end of 2015 when I participated in a conference at the University of California at Irvine, at which Simon gave what was one of the best talks in any genre of conference I've ever seen, where he imagined a future in which marine haulage was conducted by large ocean-going sail-driven vessels, modeled on the Micronesian proas or multi-hulled outrigger craft of the Western Pacific. And in the years since, I've come to know Simon as an artist, as a boat builder, as a tinkerer. He was, when I moved to Los Angeles to take up tenure at the Berggruen Institute to write this book in 2018, Simon was one of the individuals who made my stay such a pleasure. I had the opportunity to go out with him on his boat, and we've been talking for the past, coming up on 6 years, about the ecology of skill, if you will. And so it was when the opportunity arose to do this event, Simon was one of the first people I thought of as an interlocutor.
Simon, do you want to say a few words about yourself and about your connection to Josh's project, and then we can dive right into this?
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Josh and Nils. Hello, everyone. I wear many hats, along with the various practices that Josh enumerated there. I'm deeply committed to a study of embodied cognition and related approaches to cognition, particularly as they impact questions of creative practice and skill, which is one of the ways that I connect with the work that we're going to be talking about today. I think that's enough from me right now, and I'll be happy to take part in the conversation.
Great. So we're going to be introducing a bunch of conceptual categories that may be familiar to some of you in the audience, but that certainly weren't familiar to me before I started talking to Josh about this book. So there's a whole bunch of language that comes out of cognitive studies, as well as language that comes out of anthropology. And so, Josh, I'm going to ask you to lay out the argument of this book in some detail, but as you do so, and you start to introduce concepts like inactive artifacts and sensory motor skills and so on, please make sure that you define those terms as we get into them, because they won't be familiar, I imagine, to some of the people in our audience. And I will say that one of the things I found really amazing about reading this book and watching this argument, you developed this argument as we worked together a couple of years ago, was seeing the intricate architecture of the nature of the argument you were putting together, and the way in which there was a scalar nature to the argument, where you had a conception of the human being as a sensorium that it flows through the world as an embodied person, and your description in the book centers on that, and then moves out from that to layers that go all the way up to the scale of the planetary as a whole, and thinking about climate change and the way in which these embodied humans move through an Earth in which we are but an element of the biogeochemical ferment of the planet. And so I think that thinking about all of the ways in which at a scalar level those things fit together is part of what I'd like to hear you explain. But to begin with, I'd like you to start with the title of the book, which was the thing that first attracted me to this, because I think it's such an enticing thing, which is the human scaffold. When you talk about a human scaffold, what exactly do you mean by the scaffold of the human?
Thank you, Nils. Intricate would be one way to discuss the architecture of this book. Patchy would be another, and that's a theme we can return to. But when you ask about the title, the human scaffold, this is the third time in the past month that I've received this question, speaking about this book. First in a book talk here in Berlin, and then on a podcast recently. And it's a credit to you, because I did not think that there was anything particularly striking about the title, but the scaffold was the title under which I first proposed this project in late 2017. So a scaffold, in the sense in which I'm using the term, is anything that both supports and constrains the development of something else. So you can think of it not so much in the sense of the scaffolds that are erected to construct or renovate buildings, but say the scaffolds used in tissue generation, in tissue synthesis engineering. So these may be simply paper impregnated with some kind of growth medium, and in some cases the scaffold then is incorporated into the final product, be it a sheet of muscle or what have you. In the philosophy of biology, the term scaffold is used in a similar way to refer to features of the environment or behavioral phenomena that support the development of some more elaborate schema of behavior. But the term does not originate with me, and I credit in particular the philosophers of biology, William Wimsatt and Kim Sterelny, for its use, and among others. But it's a term that has not received a lot of attention outside the philosophy of science. And it seemed an appropriate way to begin when I first approached the Berggruen Institute, because I'd been thinking then already for some years about the role that different features of our environment, biospheric and built, play in scaffolding human behavior over, as you say, different scales of time, different horizons of time. And the premise of the transformations of the human program, the program focus at the Berggruen that I proposed this project to, was that certain emerging technologies play an outsized role, or will play, in prospect play an outsized role in scaffolding human behavior. And part of my motivation in applying was in a way to turn that premise on its head, to say, well, perhaps there's something other than the technological in the conventional sense that has a history of scaffolding human behavior, and that we should look at that. And so the scaffolds that I have in mind are things that do not, in the first instance, find their most salient manifestations in material stuff. It's not tools in the conventional sense. It's not technologies. It's rather simply patterns of behavior that recur. The same way certain fragments certain patterns recur in the grammar of a language. And in fact, the theory of speech registers was one inspiration for my way of thinking about the evolution of culture.
Simon, you want to jump in here?
Josh, yeah, I'd like to jump in. It's a kind of etymological conversation, I suppose, but your use of the term scaffold in my context, which is largely or more oriented towards the fine arts and engineering, I find the term armature to be at least as rich, if not richer, in the sense of the sense that you're using scaffold. For me, I'm afraid that the image of scaffold that comes to mind is those galvanized iron tubes on the outside of buildings, or more interestingly, the bamboo scaffolds that are put up in Asian cities at the blink of an eye and then torn down again. Stunning pieces of engineering, those ones, but they're really sort of contingent sorts of scaffolds that come up and go down, so they don't really fit with the way you're using the term. But I think more substantively, what you're saying now refers to something that I pulled out on page 122 of your book, which was, you make the argument, which I think is the thing you just said, that the history of technology is a history of trading off survival strategies centered on material artifacts for those centered on inactive artifacts. Now, there's a number of different things I'd love to talk to you about this. The first is that I do take some issue with the way you use the term inactive, and love to have that conversation. But clearly, in terms of anthropology, as you say, it is, and of course in cognitive archaeology and so on, we know clearly that it's very difficult to trace these inactive artifacts in the very same way that it's difficult to trace the history of music or language before writing.
Simon, if I may jump in, could we ask Josh really quickly to define the distinction between a material artifact and an active artifact?
Thank you. Yeah. So let me see how quickly I can do this. So I am, as Simon has indicated, using the term inactive in a fairly loose way, or in an elusive way. I'm using it to refer to patterns to behavior patterns that or rather artifacts that exist by virtue whose material precipitates tend to be ephemeral and of little interest in their individual instances, such as language. When I speak, the individual sounds are gone in an instant, or the individual gestures, but the artifact language persists through time and develops through time by virtue of its ongoing enactment. Now, the term inactive, in the sense that I'm using it, sort of combines this lay sense of something that is enacted with a more technical sense that grows out of a movement in the philosophy of mind that seeks to deflate theories of mind that depend on a highly elaborated internal architecture for representing our relationships with the world and with other moving beings, and simply to focus instead on how apparently sophisticated representations can arise in the moment out of the dyadic play, the back and forth, the motor resonance, if you will, between two moving beings in the world. So in that sense, I am playing fast and loose with the term. It seemed to me a more accessible term than some of the alternatives. I was drawn early on by the architect and architectural theorist Bill Hilyar's notion of a configurational artifact. So Hilliard describes cities as configurational artifacts, and he compares them in this way to languages. In other words, a city exists by virtue of the fact that we continually walk its streets, rather than by virtue of the built structure. The built structure for Hilliard is secondary. And in the same sense, for me, the fact that say we respond in a particular way to seasonal patterns and diurnal rhythms of heat and cold arises more out of the fact and more out of the recurring behavior patterns through which we manage our encounters with different environmental challenges than through the material stuff such as clothing that mediates those encounters. So that's Simon, I'd love to hear your criticism, and I'd love to hear you present a more orthodox use of an action.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Josh. I mean, having been largely schooled in the inactive cognition theory, originating with Francisco Varela and Evan Thompson, and the later work by Ezequiel de Paulo and people of that sort, my interest in the term inaction has been, as you say, in its use to specify a particular kind of interpretation of cognition in which structural coupling with the environment is a kind of an iterative structural coupling of the environment is the locus of meaning. So it moves cognition from symbol manipulation in the skull to dexterous activities in relation to one's Umwelt or one's world. I mean, that's where I situate myself with respect to that term, and clearly the inactive approach to cognition I find to be incredibly rich in terms of thinking about intelligent action in the world, whether, as you say, it be hunting or cold water diving or chipping a hand axe or skateboarding. So I quite enjoy the way that you riff on that base that I have regarding inactive cognition, and I think the things that you're picking up on is that it's dynamic, it's unfolding, it's emergent, it's iterative, but the thing that I think that you bring to it, if I'm not mistaken, is the idea that it's kind of culturally cumulative, but only because of the continual reinforcement.
Yeah, so let me make a further point, Josh, and ask you to respond to it. One of the things that's interesting about what you do in the book, and it's already becoming clear from this discussion, is that it's an argument that is both rooted in philosophy of mind and a sort of theoretical set of questions about the ontological nature of human cognition, but it's also an argument that unfolds around certain kinds of anthropological observations. And one of the key stories that actually starts the book out, and it's a quite well-known story in anthropology, is the story of the so-called loss of technology that the Tasmanians experience when they are cut off at the end of the Pleistocene from the mainland of the Australian continent. So for those who don't know, Tasmania is a fairly large island located to the south of the Australian mainland, and there's about, I think, 7,500 mile today body of water in between Tasmania and the mainland of Australia. And when the Ice Age ended and the sea levels rose, Tasmania was cut off about 10, 12,000 years ago from the mainland, and the Tasmanians lived in this southern, quite cold environment, cut off from, the rest of the world, but specifically from the Australian mainland. And during that course of their 12,000 years of isolation from contact with anybody outside of Tasmania, they shed certain kinds of physical technologies. And when the Europeans arrive in the early 19th century, they discover a people who, from the point of view of 19th century Europeans, seem to be living extremely technologically primitive lives. But the story you want to tell is something that's much more interesting, which is actually that that the choices they made about which technologies, material versus inactive, to hold on to and to develop further was actually a totally rational adaptation strategy, given the situation that they found themselves in during those 10, 12,000 years being cut off. Tell us more about that story, about what exactly happened and what the conditions that the Tasmanians took on to deal with the environment that they found themselves in Holocene Tasmania.
Thank you, Nils. So yeah, I want to say again that I'm certainly not the first to argue that that what we observe in the archaeological record in Tasmania over the past 8,000 years in particular is pro-adaptive as opposed to maladaptive, which has been the conventional view, that it represents a maladaptive devolution under isolation, under a kind of demographic impoverishment, a lack of a sufficient number of skilled models for the transmission of culture from one generation to the next. There have been a number of other observers who've said, well, actually, there's more to the story than that. But I felt after I'd been turning this debate over in my head for about 7 years when I started to write the book, and I felt there was the discussion had become very technical. In the sense that it turned on the statistical formulation of rates of cultural attrition under certain kinds of very speculative assumptions, and I wanted to bring it back to the empirical. I wanted to bring it back to the scene, to the question of what it means to cope skillfully with a marine environment in the mid 40s latitudes, or any other kind of environment, but in particular in this environment, which to European observers starting in the 17th century and then regularly from the end of the 18th century, found rather harsh, rather not to their own liking. So one of the things they encountered, and this provides the starting point for the theme of our discussion today, is that Tasmanians seem to make remarkably little use of clothing, given the fact that they inhabited a comparatively cold, damp environment, and this filtered through or in some sense laundered through the protocols of scientific disinterest that emerged with modern anthropology and archaeology. It came to be taken as one of the forms of evidence that something untoward had happened to the Tasmanians, that they were somehow the victim of the warming trend of the first third of the Holocene, starting about 11,700 years ago. In that once they were cut off from Australia, they were no longer subject to the same degree of cultural stimulation. They were too isolated, and so they could no longer sustain the cumulative culture that entails such things as fitted clothing, which you might think would be appropriate to the situation they were in. In fact, though, there are other explanations, and in particular, I wanted to focus on the question: well, what would it mean to accustom oneself to living in an environment such as Tasmania without relying on fitted clothing? Or save in winter, save in the coldest season, much of any kind of clothing, save with the exception, say, of capes made of wallaby skins. And so my concerns there are to draw out dimensions of adaptation that for some reasons that Simon has alluded to, archaeologists and evolutionary theorists tend to keep at arm's length, in part because they're very difficult to operationalize. Right? It's very difficult to quantify something such as what today we might call resilience or grit in the face of cold. Right? It's very difficult to imagine to formulate ways of testing how that could be, how that could develop over the course of childhood and adolescence, right? How that could be it's very difficult to formulate that as a skill. Whereas it's much easier to formulate things such as the operatory chain for constructing a missile weapon, such as a bow and an arrow, as a skill, because you can parcel out the operatory chain into a discrete number of steps and count up the number of parts or the number of junctions in the tools themselves. You can't do that with something like thermoregulation, and yet you can't do that with something like grit, say, with emotional resilience in the face of the frustration of being cold. And yet these for me, these clearly seemed skills. Were these choices that the Tasmanians were making in the sense of seeing before oneself or seeing before the community a panel of different options and choosing one? No, but it's rare that choices of strategy are that clear, are expressions of will in that clear-cut way. And in fact, formulating intention in this way is to some degree a product of a very modern mindset. So I don't know that that's the appropriate rubric to put on it, but nonetheless, the pathway that Tasmanians and other people who've inhabited extreme environments have gone down in foregoing material enhancement in favor of physiological and emotional enhancement is a reasonable one for a number of reasons. I mean, for one, it simply means that it's one less genre of material stuff to keep track of, to continually have to manufacture, to have to pack up and move when you shift camp, right? So the choice of whether to go for a material technology or whether to go down another path is scaffolded by a number of other factors in the way of life, such as how mobile are you? How many times are you moving camp in the course of a season? What kind of opportunities do you have to develop fortitude in the face of cold, say? Is this something that occurs developmentally? Does it necessarily entail risk of life, or is it something that could unfold naturally, even in the presence of alternatives? So I this is thinking about the climatological and epidemiological events of the past 2 years, and especially I'm in Berlin this evening, and it's been what retrospectively it looks like an exceptionally warm, wet summer, but prospectively will probably be pretty typical. And the built environment is really not cut out for it, and everyone feels kind of sticky and uncomfortable. But one of the provocations, one of the reasons that we chose this theme to open this series of conversations with was because I think the thing that no one really wants to talk about is, well, what if we can't? What if our technological meliorism, is misplaced? What if we do simply have to learn to be at ease in environments and situations that we have not had to or have forgotten how to? And that's one of the themes of the book. And and you alluded at the top to the hopefulness of the book. For me, this is not exactly a hopeful book. In some ways, the overriding theme of the book is that the ultimate end of design, whether we're designing clothing or a response to the carbon crisis, should be to design, to imagine a time when we will no longer be here, to design with the disintegration of our whole way of life in mind, not to design against that, not to see that as something to be forestalled indefinitely, but to see the goal of our enterprise here, of our project, not as one of being here forever, but of unwinding gracefully over time. And so in that sense, it's not a hopeful book, but I am hopeful, looking at the deep history of niche construction under climate change, that we can at least get used to a wider range of environmental variation than we've become accustomed to lately.
So what I found fascinating about the way you've just laid this out, Josh, is that you take this episode in Tasmania of the Tasmanians moving towards various kinds of inactive artifacts to allow them to deal with a cold, wet environment. In other words, behavioral patterns that can be transmitted, even though it's maybe hard to detect in the material records that are left behind in the archaeological in the archaeological record, there are other ways, and we all know this from our personal experiences, that there are many ways to deal with discomforts. Some of them may involve, physical objects, and some of them may involve mental calibrations. What's so interesting about what you do with this then is you then make this into an argument, elusively, but enticingly, it seems to me, about a possible strategy for dealing with our own contemporary climate change situation. I mean, the Tasmanians had to deal with their climate change crisis of the early Holocene, where temperatures rose dramatically and they had to adapt to that world. We today face a similar situation where we're seeing dramatically rising temperatures.
Yeah, we seem to have lost Nils in mid-flight there. Um, I don't know, Josh. I've got lots of things I want to talk to you about, and I guess one of them was the way that you riff on sensory ecology in a way that I find really interesting, and then I'm not sure if it's your coinage, but the term semiokinetic ecology I was pretty fascinated by. Um, and of course, it hooks into a concept from Ed Hutchins that I'm particularly involved with, which is sensory or cognitive ecology. So there are this cloud of ideas floating around here about integration with the environment and give and take. But can you say something about semiokinetic?
Yes, thank you, Simon. And let me see if I can integrate this with Nils's point, which is about scale and how I take these case studies from various points of in time and space over the past 48,000 years. And then in the second half of the book, I do, with some wobbliness, try to make them relevant or elicit their relevance for our own predicament. And scale, as Nils indicated at the top of the hour, is the crux of the issue, right? Because the societies we live in, as reviewers, early reviewers of this book, peer reviewers pointed out, is very different in terms of the degree, the number of social relations, and the number of degrees of indirection, technical indirection, mediation between ourselves and the biosphere. So one of my approaches for dealing with the challenge of scale was this device that you referred to as semiokinetic ecology. I'm struggling now with the question of whether or not what kind of legs, if any, it has for the future. But I will start with I'll explain where it came from in the moment when I was writing the final pages of the book, and in particular how I was inspired, as you said, by sensory ecology, and in particular Graham Martin's The Sensory Ecology of Birds. So sensory ecology is, as the name suggests, is an effort to describe in great detail the sensory faculties of living things, particularly higher animals, say synapsids, such as birds and mammals, with reference to the functional role that the senses play in the life of the animal. And it's not that it's not practiced in the primate world or even the human world, but it is very, very highly developed in the world of bird science. And this is for a number of reasons. Some of them are just founder effects. Some of them are just historical artifacts of how the study of avian senses got going, and in particular the avian eye, which has a larger number of cones, so a more supple form of color vision in some ways than mammalian vision. So I I was looking for a device, a conceptual formula that would allow me to summarize neatly what I'd been doing over the course of the book, and bring its application to our own problems, into a productive dialogue with its application to the problems in the first half of the book, such as those in Tasmania and later on in Southwest Australia. And early on, a few weeks before I started writing the book proper, a colleague said to me, it seems like you're really out to formulate a new discipline. And I said, well, yeah. And over the ensuing 8 or 9 months, I was thinking, well, what is this discipline, and how would I describe it, and what is it? Is it something more essentially like sensory ecology, but just with a particular mood, particular vibe, or is there some way to make it more distinct? So the idea behind semiokinetic ecology is that I didn't want to limit the scope of the object of inquiry simply to sensory stuff, or even sensory motor stuff as it's conventionally understood. And this was part of something, Simon, that you've alluded to earlier, which is that I was moving away from the actionist or enactive school of philosophy of mind. I didn't want to simply rehearse those ideas. I wanted to push them further. One of my concerns, and I didn't want this book to be an exercise in discipline management, but one of the reasons I was dissatisfied with a lot of what's been going on in the philosophy of mind and its inapplicability to real problems in anthropology is that it continues to be so focused on sensory motor coordination, right? Sort of these reaching and grasping activities, which are central, say, to the work of using tools in a machine shop, such as you describe in some of your recent work, but leave out a lot of the less visible, as it were, internal stuff, the central pattern generation, the relationship, say, between breathing and locomotion. And these are things, this point that these are two separate strands in the evolution of the central nervous system has been made by others, by Fred Kaiser, by Peter Godfrey Smith. So I wanted to draw out the anthropological implications of paying more attention, paying less attention to this sensory motor coordination in the conventional sense, and more to the relationship between signaling processes and expressive processes, as it were, both within the body and in the relationship between body and world. And so,
Josh, could I cut in there, because I just want to make an observation, or two observations, in fact, which I think are really important. Just in the general flow of the book and the resources you draw on. And one of them is the way, as I'm interested in doing also, that you combine studies which have been particularly focused on the human with ecology and ethological studies. And there's a push towards a sort of anti-human exceptionalism, which kind of points up the anthropocentrism of an awful lot of academic disciplines. And I'm totally in your camp there in terms of those ideas. And the other part of it is, which is equally provocative, I think, is that in proposing this kind of semiokinetic ecology notion, you're proposing a kind of Hegelian synthesis, in a way, between internalist and externalist notions of cognition, which I have to say is a place that I have come to myself, having been a sort of externalist and activist partisan for a decade or two, and I'm beginning to, as you are, attempt to integrate those ideas back into a sort of larger sense of meaning making, which has to include conceptualization and the like.
Well, I appreciate that, Simon. I do want to make sure that we don't get too much into the inside of baseball, and I think Nils might have one question for you, and then I think we should take some questions from the audience if there are any.
Simon, let me pose this question to you. Josh has laid out a again. I'm going to insist, Josh, on calling this a somewhat hopeful framework. That one of the things we can do in the face of climate change and other kinds of ecological changes that we're facing, in the coming decades and centuries, is think about inactive technological approaches, at least as a complement to material technological approaches. But Simon, some of your work, particularly around contemporary digital media and the effects of contemporary digital media on our cognitive function, gives us pause about whether we're actually at the very moment where we need to be able to develop new kinds of inactive artifacts of the sort Josh is describing, maybe decaying our capacity to do so. Can you explain how that, how media and our constant interaction with screens might be actually degrading our capacity to create new kinds of inactive artifacts?
Yes, thank you so much, Nils. To give a quick synopsis of what you're referring to, I've just recently published a paper called Sensory Motor Debility in Digital Cultures. And it's an issue that I've been thinking about for many years, observing the cultural change around the utilization of digital technologies. And it's because as a practitioner and developer of those digital technologies, I've been closely connected with them and their use. And it's of course, there are any number of different classes of negative reports and doomsayers about digital technologies and our dependence on digital technologies and the development of echo chamber niches on social media and the destabilization of states by state-funded hackers and the like, all sorts of different questions which we are dealing with. The specific issues that I wanted to deal with have to do with the sensory motor debilitation that's associated with the notion of user friendliness and so-called intuitive interfaces, and in particular the way that increasingly users are unaware that the system is fixing their mistakes in the background. So there's this, in a sense, this is the offloading of cognition into technological ancillary devices in a kind of cognitive ecology. And absolutely, we're immersed in a very complex cognitive ecology, as we do things like what we're doing right now. But there is disturbing medical evidence accumulating that the particular form that these technologies have taken in their development, driven by exclusively commodity capitalist motivations, is that we are seeing a range of different kinds of debilitation of the physiological or cognitive kind, from measurable changes in the development of infants' brains, comparing groups that are heavily use screens and groups that don't, quite clearly in the visual field, fixation on a screen during a kind of developmental period will reduce the capability of the optomuscular system to for instance, focus quickly from distance focus to close focus, or to track objects in the peripheral vision, or to function in conditions of suboptimal lighting, all of which are sorts of trainings that a person would gather in a pre-digital developmental environment, whether you're playing football or chasing frogs in the underbrush as an infant. There are kinds of accidental development and exercising of sensory motor capabilities that measurably we are losing, or that are being lost amongst certain communities. The rate of child and adolescent myopia has skyrocketed in parallel with the increase of hours of exposure to screens, etc., just to name one very specific example.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all, particularly those of us who are of a certain age, experienced what I sometimes think of as the infantilization, although that's probably an insult to infants, of our ability to interact with the world. I mean, I just think, for example, the most obvious one I always like to cite is the way in which we all rely now to a somewhat alarming degree on digital navigation systems to move through space. And it used to be when I was not even a child, when I was a young adult, that I would show up in a new city and I just had to figure out how to get through that city sort of by navigating by landmarks and the general sense of the flow of the city to get to wherever I wanted to go. Now, we all just pull out our phone, we get to any new city and it'll automatically tell us all the left and right turns, and we fail to develop those kinds of cognitive capacities to navigate through space. And I think if you never develop them in the first place, it's probably even harder to retrofit that sort of thing. I'd like to now turn to a couple of questions from the audience.
We lost you again there, Nils, or at least you appear to have frozen for me, but then again, no, Josh isn't frozen. There you are, you're back.
What are the kinds of behavioral adjustments that humans might need to make, inactive artifacts, if you will, that we would need to develop to be able to cope and adapt to the kinds of changes that the ecosystem, the planetary ecosystem, seems to be unfolding in front of us right now in quite dramatic ways. And maybe I'll turn that first to Josh, but I'd also love to hear Simon's thoughts on that.
Thank you, Nils. Oh, that's exactly the kind of question I dread, because it requires me actually to draw practical inferences from my lovely theory making. Well, certainly the stuff about body temperature regulation, but also about accommodating oneself to a wider range of ambient temperatures is one of is going to be one salient dimension for the next couple of generations. I mean, in the book, I do talk about a series of efforts to draw inferences about what the effects of a warming climate would be on physical activity, on sleep habits. And these were papers that were published a few years ago and used public health surveillance data from the United States and correlated them with weather at the time that that survey data were collected, to speculate about what rates of sleeplessness you could attribute to heat, say in 50 or 100 years. But of course, already the projections that the projections about the rate at which the climate would be changing that were used in these papers published in 2017 or 2018 feel a bit are probably out of date. Beyond simply learning to tolerate, learning to think clearly and to screen out the the effects of heat on the skin. You know, really the learning not to be distracted by tactile sensations of stickiness or prickliness from heat, learning to be more strategic about times of the day that you rest, that you eat, that you sleep, that you're active, that you do things that require focused thinking. You know, that's certainly one dimension.
I could answer your question for you, Josh, if you wanted me to. I mean,
I invited you, Simon, specifically because as an experienced boat builder and mariner, I felt I had the sense that you've encountered a wide range of conditions in which you've been exposed to environmental extremes and not had the option simply to retreat indoors for a nice cup of tea. So
that's very kind, and I think that's true. And there's a kind of there's something that you bring up in the book about preserving skills that are not often used because in certain occasions of deprivation or whatever, they might become important. And that certainly ties in with the question that Nils just asked me about the sensory-motor debility in digital cultures issue too, is there is something about versatility and improvisation that if you don't have a store and a background of possible ways to respond to a situation, then that's a pretty hopeless condition. So this is really an argument for radical interdisciplinarity, about preserving ways of doing things because they may come in handy in the future, I suppose. But the question I think that it begs is what does it take to learn how to improvise?
This is
Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, so thank you, Simon. So just Simon is referring to, there's one of the recurring bits, if you will, in the book is this concept of a skills reservoir, and in the mathematical formalisms that have become dominant and in fact have been very helpful in explaining evolution, including social evolution, notably the population games with recurring interactions between individuals in a population with periodic strategy revision so that you have the chance to evolve. But one of the problems with evolutionary game theory is that it does not make provision for skills reservoirs. It doesn't have a way of accounting for the fact that there's stuff we do that seems never to be utility maximizing. It seems never to be the best strategy, or maybe once in a generation, right? And yet it persists through time. And these things are often practices that require years of training, right? So you can't simply, you need to keep it on hand. You need to practice it, and you need to take an active role in making sure that it abides in the community through the long periods of time when it's not in use. And so certainly, Simon, if what you're suggesting is that we need to institutionalize mechanisms for the construction and for the maintenance of skills reservoirs around stuff that might be appropriate to a climatically changed world. I think that's definitely a first step toward thinking about what sorts of institutional responses, what sorts of collective responses could we imagine to the carbon crisis. You know, I'll just say briefly, some people who, if you read a lot of my work, you may begin to realize that my entire oeuvre is really sort of a following up or a chasing down of the work of Bruce Chatwin in an effort to show both why he was so wrong and also why some of his work is so compelling, as his popularizing work. And the other night, my partner and I watched the new documentary that Werner Herzog has, Nomad, which is about his friendship with Chatwin. So for me, this was kind of a dream come true. And when in Chatwin's own telling of how he got started as a traveler, he woke up one morning, some years into his tenure as a porter at Sotheby's, at the auctioneers, and found that he could not see. And he went to the ophthalmologist, and the ophthalmologist said, "There's nothing wrong with your eyes. You've just been staring at pictures up close for too long. You need to get work some long vistas into your life." And so he went to Sudan for a month and found that it changed him. And of course, there's a certain self-mythologizing in this story, as there is in every element of his life. But there's also a kernel of wisdom there. And I'm reminded of a story that Herzog tells about being caught in a storm in Patagonia, during the making of Screaming of Stones, where he happened to, this was after Chatwin had died, and he had Chatwin's rucksack with him, and he sat on it bivvied in the ice, trying to wait out this 2-day storm before they could be rescued by helicopter. And that's what, that would be one way to look at the situation we're in, right? I don't want to be over dramatic. When I'm a bit ill at ease with even referring to crisis in the title of the book, because when we talk about a crisis, when we adopt a permanent crisis mindset, we adopt a foreshortened horizon of expectation, right? We start to think in terms of the number of years or maybe decades until some part of the earth is no longer inhabitable, right? When what we need is to adopt a really long horizon. And if we adopted a long horizon, one of the things we might do, is start to institutionalize this idea of skills reservoirs, of maintaining the old ways, as it were.
Let me ask a final question on the same note to Simon. Do you think that there are specific, shall we say, sensory motor training exercises that we should be enacting in our pedagogy? Both, or not just in our pedagogy for our children, but also in our own personal lives. And I don't want to turn this necessarily into a self-help question, but are there practices we should think about as a society and as individuals for maintaining this skills reservoir that Josh was referring to, and for maintaining ourselves in a posture of flexibility towards the creation of inactive artifacts?
Well, that's a huge question, and perhaps we can do a second podcast on the very subject, Nils. But the thing that occurs to me, as someone who comes out of a tradition as a practicing artist, my training was in sculpture, and having, in a sense, come belatedly into the academy, I certainly see that the predilection of the academy for abstraction in general is a problem. And in my critique of computing, and I've just been thinking about this because I've been writing a chapter for an encyclopedia on my struggles with proceeding with my practice in light of what the capacities for computing were. What I realized was that the ethos of digital computing was fundamentally informed by the Cartesian dualism and the privileging of abstraction over materiality. And therefore, it was rather difficult to use that technology to create experiences which were sensorially immediate and engaging and conveyed meaning in a way that was not specifically textual or a matter of streams of abstract symbols. So in general, I feel as though one's sensory motor engagement with the world has been given extremely short shrift in the academy and in STEM learning, and the emphasis in STEM learning right now is, I think, a very dangerous thing in this sense, in terms of skills reservoirs and the kind of sensory motor debility that I was drawing attention to as a result of dependence on these technologies, which are fundamentally technologies of symbolic representation. And all of this stuff we're talking about is something else. And the fact that we really don't train ourselves, we're losing certain capacities to simply engage with the material world in a diverse range of ways, I think is quite problematic. That would be my answer to the question.
All right. Well, this has been a very rich conversation. We're at the bottom of the hour, so I think we're going to have to wrap up. I want to thank both of you, Simon, Penny, for challenging interventions here, and Josh Berson for having written a really interesting book. Again, it's The Human Scaffold. I recommend it to everybody, and it's available from UC Press now. Thank you both for taking the time, and thank you to everybody in the audience for listening.
Also, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you. And thank you, Simon.
It's been a pleasure. Nice to speak with you both.